communities. Think about this. When we talk about seeing an individual that is far away from God and they're having problems in their life, which is usually what happens, right? And sometimes if you're an up and outer, you got too much debt and you're living above your means and you've got maybe trying to hide all your problems through alcoholism or whatever. If you're a down and outer, you might not have an adequate job. You might live in the hood. You might not really have everything you need to live a life that is thriving and pleasing to God. But the idea is that when we encounter a person, no matter where they are, we think if we're a believer, we need to see the gospel transform that individual's life. I think that one of the big challenges that we have as a church is to take that idea about how we look at individuals and to begin to take seriously what it means to transform the neighborhoods in which people live, okay? So when we talk about reaching out to these neighborhoods, to me it's a very complex thing because a lot of the things that we immediately think about that might help people can actually hurt people if we don't do it in a way that's wise. And I would say that's even biblical, okay? So I am most concerned about how do we take the good news of the kingdom and as the church make that priority of reaching the most under-resourced neighborhoods of our country and our nation. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the world today, okay, because I think we would just be blown away. Think about it, 7 billion people on the planet, and we are focusing so much of our energy on 300 million that live in this place that we call North America, the United States. I don't know about you, but if God loves the world, we're just a little blip on the radar compared to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world does not live like you and I live, okay? But a concern to me is in the richest nation of the world that there are 50 million people plus, and that number is growing every day with the way the economy is today, that are barely surviving. I've had people come back from Africa and Latin America and some of the most depressed places in the world, most under-resourced places in the world, and say, what I find in the United States when I go into the hood, when I go into the barrio, is a hopelessness that I don't see anywhere else in the world. You know, and many of you can attest to that. You've traveled internationally, you've worked internationally, and you go places and people are, they're working to make a living. They know that they're never going to have the lifestyle of many people of the top 1% in their countries, let alone the North and the United States. But there is a sense of dignity and work and joy. But the concern is, how do we be faithful to the gospel of the kingdom in this context when we talk about reaching the neighborhoods, and it's not difficult to know what neighborhoods those are, okay? In Chicago, it's the South Side, it's Inglewood, it's Lawndale, it's Austin, it's these communities where, the kind of tragedy that happened in Colorado recently where, somebody goes in and shoots up a mall and 30 people are shot and killed, that happens every weekend in Chicago, okay? This is the reality that many of our communities face. And here's the burden that I have in my heart and that I believe that I'd love us to take seriously. Matthew 4:24, it says that Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among them. The good news of the kingdom. I've been thinking a lot about what that means. Is there a difference between what we think about in the U.S. and in the West about what the good news is, the proclamation of the gospel of what God did for us and what we need to do to be right with Him? Is there a difference between that and what Jesus talks about here when He calls it the good news of the kingdom? And what about later on in Matthew where He says, this is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If that is our prayer, if that's what our prayer is to be, how does the kingdom manifest itself in these poor communities in our nation? And what role do we have as a church? Well, I would like to suggest that the book of Nehemiah is a great book to help us get a grip on what we might need to learn and see as a church. Now, we've all read Nehemiah. We use it all the time. But I would like to contend this morning that we usually use it for two purposes. Number one, it's a book about leadership, right? Great leadership purposes, practical principles in the book of Nehemiah. And we've all preached on Nehemiah if you're a leader. The second thing we use it for is building fund campaigns, right? I mean, hey, we got to rebuild the walls, and it usually means nicer carpet and a new building and a new auditorium, and we've all preached it around that. But the historical context of the last historical book in the Bible is the book of Nehemiah. And it is a story of a burned out, unhealthy, under-resourced community that matters to God. Okay? You know what I'd like to contend this morning? That every community matters to God. Every community matters to God. And listen, most of us intentionally choose the neighborhood we live in, and we make comments like, I want to live somewhere where my family's safe. I want to go where schools are good. I want to go where there's great resources, where there's parks. Almost every one of us, we all do this. We choose where we live because of all those things. And yet, when we talk about ministering and reaching out with the gospel to these poor neighborhoods, here's usually what our conversation is reduced to. We're going to go take the gospel to those people. We're going to go take a message to those people. We're going to go and kind of spend some time there to do a little bit of work in those communities. But we don't usually talk about helping to transform those communities so that they can be the same kind of neighborhoods that you and I live in every single day. Okay? So what are these lessons out of Nehemiah that might help us? Okay? Number one, we need a new burden. We need a new burden. Okay? I love chapter 1 of Nehemiah. It says, in late autumn, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was at the fortress of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. And I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. And they said to me, and listen to this, and this could be said about so many visits to the hood, to the barrio in our nation. Things are not going well for those who return from the province of Judah. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, I fasted, and I prayed to the God of heaven. I believe, like all good ministry, God-inspired ministry, Christ-centered ministry, it all starts with a burden that God places on people's hearts. If there is not a burden, there's no transformation. If there's not a burden, there's no love. You can't love somebody unless you really have a burden for them. Now, a number of years ago, when my kids were little, I had the chance to be the chaplain for the Chicago Cubs for 5 years, okay? It did not help them at all, okay? All right? And one of my favorite stories is during that time, we got a chance to go to a lot of games, and I would take my sons and everything. And my 10-year-old son at that time came to me and said, Dad, if the Cubs win the World Series, can I get a Cub tattoo? I said, absolutely. I said, sure, no problem, I had absolutely no, I am a man of faith, all right? But here's the thing. If I was to reach those ball players, a different world than me, because I'm a guy who works in the hood, in the barrio. I'm reaching out to poor folks all the time, I looked at these ball players who are rich, famous, wealthy. What problem do you have? Don't come talking to me about you're having trouble with your investments and, you got too many fans and this is ridiculous. Well, if I have that attitude, I'm not going to reach those ball players. But, because of the great work of God in my heart, he gave me a burden to go to the ballpark as often as I could. and I had to go and be in that locker room with those ball players as often as I could, get to know the wives. Whenever I had the opportunity, I had to get on the team plane and go to their away games. And I had to stay at the hotels where they stayed. And I had to eat where they ate. I mean, somebody had to do it, right? Now, I share that facetiously because everything I just said is really true. There's a great ministry, Baseball Chapel, that has a ministry that reaches out to ball players. And if you watch the World Series this week, many of those ball players, you could tell they were following Christ because of the way they spoke. You cannot reach people without a burden. Friends, here's my burning passion and concern and desire is that more of us in the church would get a passion like Nehemiah for the broken, under-resourced neighborhoods of our world and of our country, where we could not drive by those neighborhoods and say, dang, tough being them. Too bad. I'm so glad I get to go to my cul-de-sac neighborhood. I mean, you know what Jesus did? And our brother who just spoke, he said, look, it ought to be resembling, what we do ought to resemble Jesus. Nehemiah's burden led him to not only feel brokenhearted and feel pity, but what did he do? He went to his boss, the king of Persia, and he said, I need a leave of absence. I'm going to step down from my job, and I want to take another position. I want to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild that city. He appointed him governor, the idea that a politician could make a difference. Okay, that's a really interesting thought these days. Okay, but God, the burden of Nehemiah leads him to go, and then he says, you know what? I need all these connections. I need to harness all the connections that I've made in my life and my role. He never himself ever lived in Jerusalem, but his family was from there. His ancestors were from there. He knew all the history. God gave him a burden, and he could not shake that burden. And I want to say this very, very clearly, that the burden of Nehemiah was to please God and to